The morning of April 26, 1986, began like any other in the Soviet city of Pripyat, Ukraine. Children prepared for school. Workers headed to their shifts, and life continued its predictable rhythm in this model socialist city built to house the families of those who worked at the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. What none of them knew was that in the early hours of that morning, the world had witnessed the worst nuclear disaster in human history, an event that would forever change not only their lives, but the course of nuclear energy development globally. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located about 130 kilometers north of Kiev, was a symbol of Soviet technological prowess and the promise of peaceful atomic energy. Named after the nearby ancient town of Chernobyl, which itself derives from the Ukrainian word for wormwood, the facility represented the pinnacle of Soviet nuclear engineering. The plant housed 4 RBMK 1000 reactors, each capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electrical power, with plans for 2 additional reactors that would make it one of the largest nuclear facilities in the world. The RBMK reactor design was uniquely Soviet, standing for Reactor Bolshoi Moksnosti Kanalny, which translates to high-power channel-type reactor. These massive structures were fundamentally different from the pressurized water reactors common in the West. The RBMK design used graphite as a neutron moderator and water as a coolant, with uranium fuel contained in individual pressure tubes rather than a single pressure vessel. This design allowed for continuous refueling without shutting down the reactor, a significant advantage for maintaining consistent power output. However, this same design contained inherent safety flaws that would prove catastrophic. The reactor core itself was an enormous structure, standing over 7 meters tall and containing 1,661 fuel channels arranged in a cylindrical formation. Each channel contained uranium fuel assemblies, and the entire core was surrounded by a massive graphite moderator weighing approximately 1,700 tons. The graphite served to slow down neutrons, making them more likely to cause fission in the uranium fuel. Water flowed through the fuel channels, serving both as a coolant and as a secondary moderator. This dual-purpose system created a complex relationship between water levels, steam production, and reactor power that would become crucial to understanding the disaster. One of the most dangerous characteristics of the RBMK design was its positive void coefficient at low power levels. In simple terms, this meant that if water in the reactor turned to steam or was lost, the nuclear reaction would actually increase rather than decrease. This was the opposite of most Western reactor designs, which had negative void coefficients that made them inherently safer. When water was lost in an RBMK reactor operating at low power, the remaining water became less effective at absorbing neutrons, allowing more neutrons to be absorbed by the uranium fuel and increasing the rate of fission. This created a potentially runaway reaction that could only be controlled by inserting control rods or adding more water to the system. The control system of the RBMK reactor relied on 211 control rods made of boron carbide, a material that absorbs neutrons and thus slows or stops the nuclear reaction. These rods could be inserted into or withdrawn from the reactor core to control the power output. However, the RBMK design had a fatal flaw in its control rod system. The rods had graphite tips, and when they were fully withdrawn from the reactor, these graphite tips were replaced by water in the control rod channels. When the rods were rapidly inserted in an emergency shutdown, known as a scram, the graphite tips would displace the water and actually cause a brief increase in reactivity before the boron carbide portion of the rod could take effect. This design flaw would prove to be the immediate cause of the explosion. The Soviet nuclear program had developed rapidly in the decades following World War II, driven by both military needs and the desire to demonstrate technological superiority during the Cold War. First Soviet nuclear reactor had achieved criticality in 1946, and by the 1950s, the USSR was actively developing both weapons and civilian nuclear technology. The RBMK design emerged from this program as a way to produce both electricity and weapons-grade plutonium, making it attractive to Soviet planners who valued dual-use technologies. The development of the RBMK reactor was led by Nikolai Dalizl and his team at the Research and Development Institute of Power Engineering, known by its Russian acronym NITID. Dalizl was a brilliant engineer who had worked on the Soviet atomic bomb project and understood the complex physics of nuclear reactors. However, the RBMK design was developed under intense pressure to produce results quickly and economically, which led to compromises in safety systems and containment structures that would later prove problematic. The first RBMK reactor began operation at Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant in 1973, followed by additional units at various locations across the Soviet Union. The design was considered successful because it used natural uranium fuel, which the Soviet Union could produce domestically, and it could be refueled while operating, maximizing electricity production. The reactors were also relatively inexpensive to build compared to Western designs, making them attractive for a Soviet economy that was struggling to keep pace with Western technological development. Construction of the Chernobyl plant began in 1970, with the first reactor coming online in 1977. The facility was built using standardized Soviet construction methods and materials, with an emphasis on speed and cost-effectiveness rather than redundant safety systems. The reactor building itself was not contained within the type of reinforced concrete containment structure common in Western plants. Instead, the RBMK reactors were housed in buildings designed primarily to protect against external threats, rather than to contain a potential release of radioactive material. The construction process at Chernobyl reflected broader issues within the Soviet construction industry. Quality control was often inadequate, materials were sometimes substandard, and construction schedules were driven more by political deadlines and engineering requirements. Workers were often inadequately trained for the specialized work required in nuclear construction, and safety protocols were frequently ignored in the rush to meet construction targets. These problems would later contribute to maintenance issues and operational difficulties at the plant. The workforce at Chernobyl represented the elite of Soviet nuclear engineering. Plant operators underwent extensive training, though this training focused heavily on normal operations rather than emergency procedures. The Soviet nuclear program operated under a culture of secrecy and hierarchy that discouraged questioning of procedures or reporting of safety concerns. This culture would prove problematic when operators encountered unexpected situations that required quick thinking and deviation from established procedures. The training program for RBMK operators was comprehensive in some respects, but deficient in others. Operators learned the complex physics of the reactor and the intricate procedures for normal operation, but they received limited training on the reactor's behavior under abnormal conditions. The positive void coefficient and other potentially dangerous characteristics of the RBMK design were not emphasized in training, and operators were not fully aware of the conditions that could lead to reactor instability. The management structure at Chernobyl reflected the hierarchical nature of Soviet society. Plant directors were typically appointed based on political reliability as much as technical competence, and they were under constant pressure to meet production targets and avoid reporting problems that might reflect poorly on the Soviet nuclear program. This created an environment where safety concerns were often subordinated to production goals and where bad news was frequently suppressed or minimized. By 1986, the Chernobyl plant was operating 4 reactors, with construction underway on reactors 5 and 6. The facility employed thousands of workers and had become the economic heart of the region. The plant was considered one of the most successful in the Soviet nuclear program, with a good safety record and high capacity factors. However, there had been several incidents over the years that should have served as warnings about the potential for more serious problems. In 1982, Reactor 1 at Chernobyl experienced a partial fuel melt that was similar in some respects to what would happen in 1986, though on a much smaller scale. The incident was covered up and not reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency as required by international agreements. This pattern of secrecy and denial of problems was endemic in the Soviet nuclear program and contributed to a lack of learning from operational experience. The nearby city of Pripyat, built specifically to house plant workers and their families, had grown to a population of nearly 50,000 people. The city was considered a model of Soviet urban planning, with modern apartments, schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities that made it one of the most desirable places to live in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Pripyat was a young city with an average age of just 26, and it was home to many of the brightest minds in Soviet nuclear engineering. Life in Pripyat was comfortable by Soviet standards. Residents enjoyed access to consumer goods that were often unavailable elsewhere in the Soviet Union, and the city had a vibrant cultural life with theaters, sports facilities, and parks. The proximity to the nuclear plant was seen as a source of pride rather than concern, as nuclear energy was portrayed as clean, safe, and modern. Few residents had any real understanding of the risks associated with nuclear power, and the plant was generally viewed as a benign neighbor. The events that led to the disaster began not with a malfunction or accident, but with a planned safety test. The test was designed to determine whether the plant's turbine generators could provide enough electrical power to run essential safety systems during the brief period between a loss of external power and the startup of emergency diesel generators. This was a legitimate safety concern, as a complete loss of electrical power could leave the reactor without cooling water circulation, potentially leading to a meltdown. The concept behind the test was sound and addressed a real safety issue. In the event of a loss of external electrical power, the reactor's safety systems would need to continue operating until the emergency diesel generators could start up and take over. However, there was a gap of about 60 seconds between the loss of external power and the full operation of the diesel generators. During this time, the reactor would need to rely on some other source of power to maintain cooling water circulation. The test was designed to determine whether the kinetic energy stored in the spinning turbine generator could be used to power the cooling pumps during this critical period. As the turbine slowed down after being disconnected from the steam supply, it would continue to generate electricity for a short time. The question was whether this electricity would be sufficient to keep the cooling pumps running until the diesel generators came online. The test had been attempted twice before, but had been unsuccessful due to various technical issues. Plant management was under pressure to complete the test, as it was required for the reactor to receive its final safety certification. The test was scheduled to be conducted during a planned maintenance shutdown of Reactor 4, which would allow the operators to gradually reduce power and simulate the conditions of an emergency shutdown. The test procedure called for reducing the reactor power to between 700 and 1,000 megawatts thermal, then disconnecting the turbine generator from the electrical grid and allowing it to coast down while measuring how long it could continue to power the reactor's cooling pumps. The test was considered routine, and the operators had conducted similar tests on other reactors without incident. However, the test scheduled for April 25, 1986, began to go wrong almost immediately. The day shift operators began reducing reactor power as planned, but at 2 p.m., the Kiev electrical grid controller requested that the plant delay the test because electricity was needed elsewhere in the grid. This delay would prove crucial, as it meant that the test would be conducted by the less experienced night shift rather than the day shift that had been preparing for it. The delay also meant that the reactor would be operating at reduced power for an extended period, which would increase the buildup of xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing fission product that would make the reactor more difficult to control. The day shift operators were aware of this issue, but they were under pressure from grid operators to maintain power production, so they agreed to the delay. When power reduction resumed at 11:10 p.m., the operators encountered their first serious problem. Due to a combination of operator error and automatic control system responses, the reactor power dropped much lower than intended, falling to just 30 megawatts thermal instead of the planned 701,000 megawatts. At this extremely low power level, the reactor entered a dangerous condition known as xenon poisoning. Xenon-135 is a fission product that absorbs neutrons very effectively, acting as a neutron poison that reduces reactor power. Under normal operating conditions, Xenon-135 is burned up by the neutron flux as quickly as it is produced. However, when reactor power drops suddenly, Xenon-135 continues to be produced from the decay of other fission products while not being burned up as quickly. This creates a situation where the reactor becomes increasingly difficult to control, as the xenon absorbs neutrons that would otherwise sustain the nuclear reaction. The physics of xenon poisoning are complex and were not fully understood by all operators. Xenon-135 has a half-life of about 9 hours, so it will eventually decay away if the reactor is shut down. However, during the first few hours after a power reduction, the xenon concentration actually increases as it is produced from the decay of iodine-135, which has a 6.6-hour half-life. This means that the reactor becomes progressively more difficult to restart for several hours after a shutdown. The night shift operators, led by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, faced a difficult decision. They could either shut down the reactor and wait 24 to 48 hours for the xenon to decay naturally, or they could attempt to raise power by withdrawing more control rods. Shutting down would mean delaying the test for weeks, as the reactor was scheduled for extended maintenance. Under pressure to complete the test, Dyatlov ordered the operators to withdraw additional control rods to overcome the xenon poisoning and raise reactor power. Anatoly Dyatlov was an experienced nuclear engineer who had worked in the Soviet nuclear program for many years. He was known for his technical competence, but also for his authoritarian management style and his impatience with safety procedures that he considered overly conservative. Dyatlov had been involved in the Soviet nuclear submarine program before coming to Chernobyl, and he brought with him a military-style approach to operations that emphasized meeting objectives regardless of obstacles. This decision violated several safety procedures and put the reactor in an extremely dangerous configuration. By 1 a.m. on April 26th, the operators had withdrawn most of the control rods from the reactor core, leaving only a handful inserted. This left them with very little ability to control the reactor if something went wrong. The reactor power had been raised to about 200 megawatts thermal, still far below the intended test level, but high enough to proceed with the experiment. The withdrawal of so many control rods created a reactor configuration that was inherently unstable. With most of the neutron-absorbing control rods removed from the core, the reactor was being kept subcritical, primarily by the neutron-absorbing properties of water coolant and the xenon poison. This was a precarious balance that could be easily upset by changes in water temperature, steam production, or other factors. The reactor physics at this point were extremely complex and dangerous. The RBMK reactor's positive void coefficient meant that any reduction in water density would increase reactivity. At the same time, the reactor was operating in a region where small changes in conditions could lead to large changes in power output. The operators were essentially walking a tightrope, trying to maintain stable conditions in a reactor that was configured in an inherently unstable manner. At 1:03 a.m., the operators began the actual test by closing the turbine stop valves, which cut off steam flow to the turbine and began the coast down phase. This action had several immediate effects on the reactor. With less steam being drawn off, the water in the reactor began to heat up and produce more steam. The increased steam production reduced the density of water in the fuel channels, which in an RBMK reactor at low power actually increases reactivity due to the positive void coefficient. The closure of the turbine stop valves also affected the reactor's cooling system. With less steam being removed from the reactor, the pressure in the steam system began to increase, which affected the flow of cooling water through the reactor core. The operators had to manually adjust various systems to compensate for these changes, adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. As reactivity increased, the automatic control system began inserting control rods to compensate. However, with so few rods available for automatic control, the system was unable to maintain stable power. The reactor power began to oscillate, and the operators found themselves in an increasingly unstable situation. The water level in the steam separator drums began to drop as more water turned to steam, and the operators had to manually start additional cooling pumps to maintain water flow. The automatic control system of the RBMK reactor was designed to maintain stable power output under normal operating conditions, but it was not well suited to the extreme conditions that existed during the test. The system relied on feedback from neutron detectors and other sensors to adjust control rod positions, but the response time of the system was relatively slow compared to the rapid changes that were occurring in the reactor. The operators were also dealing with conflicting indications from their instruments. Some readings suggested that the reactor was stable, while others indicated that conditions were deteriorating. The complexity of the RBMK reactor made it difficult to get a clear picture of what was happening, and the operators had to rely on their experience and judgment to interpret the various signals they were receiving. By 1:19 a.m., the situation had become critical. The reactor was producing far more steam than normal. The water level was dropping, despite the additional pumps, and the power was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The operators should have shut down the reactor immediately, but they were committed to completing the test and may not have fully understood the danger they were in. The pressure to complete the test came from multiple sources. Plant management was under pressure from higher authorities to demonstrate that Soviet reactors were safe and reliable. The test was required for the reactor safety certification, and delaying it would reflect poorly on the plant's performance. There was also a cultural factor at work, as Soviet engineers were expected to overcome obstacles and achieve their objectives regardless of difficulties. At 1:23 a.m., shift supervisor Alexander Akimov made the decision to proceed with an emergency shutdown, known as a scram, by pressing the AZ5 button that would insert all control rods into the reactor core. This should have been the action that saved the reactor and prevented disaster. Instead, it triggered the explosion that would make Chernobyl synonymous with nuclear catastrophe. Alexander Akimov was an experienced reactor operator who had worked at Chernobyl for several years. He was known as a competent and safety-conscious operator who followed procedures carefully. His decision to initiate the CRAM was the correct response to the deteriorating conditions in the reactor, but he could not have known about the design flaw that would make this action catastrophic. When the AZ5 button was pressed, all 211 control rods began to insert into the reactor core simultaneously. However, due to the design flaw in the RBMK control rod system, the graphite tips of the rods initially displaced water in the control rod channels, causing a brief but significant increase in reactivity. With the reactor already in an unstable condition and operating with a positive void coefficient, this additional reactivity caused power to spike dramatically. The physics of what happened next are complex but crucial to understanding the disaster. As the control rods began to insert, their graphite tips displaced water in the control rod channels. In a reactor with a positive void coefficient operating at low power, this displacement of water caused an immediate increase in reactivity. The power spike was so rapid and so large that it overwhelmed all of the reactor safety systems. Within seconds, the reactor power increased to levels far beyond its design capacity. Estimates suggest that power may have reached 30,000 megawatts, thermal or more, roughly 10 times the reactor's normal full power output. This enormous power surge caused the fuel to heat up rapidly, leading to the rupture of fuel channels and the production of massive amounts of steam. The pressure from this steam, combined with the rapid heating of the graphite moderator, created forces that the reactor structure could not withstand. The fuel elements themselves began to disintegrate under the extreme conditions. The uranium dioxide fuel pellets, normally contained within zirconium cladding tubes, began to melt and react with the cladding and cooling water. This created a complex mixture of molten fuel, metal, and other materials that would later be called corium. The formation of corium released additional energy and contributed to the destruction of the reactor core. At 1 hour 23 minutes and 58 seconds a.m., approximately 40 seconds after the SCRAM button was pressed, the first explosion occurred. This was likely a steam explosion caused by the rapid vaporization of water in the reactor core. The explosion was powerful enough to lift the 2,000-ton upper biological shield, known as the reactor lid or ELENA, several meters into the air. This massive concrete and steel structure, designed to provide radiation shielding during normal operations, was blown off the reactor like a bottle cap. The first explosion was immediately followed by a second, even more powerful explosion. The nature of this second explosion has been debated by scientists and engineers for decades. Some believe it was another steam explosion, while others argue it was a nuclear explosion caused by the formation of a critical mass of nuclear material. Regardless of its exact nature, the second explosion completely destroyed the reactor core and the building housing it, sending radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. Recent research has suggested that the second explosion may have been caused by the interaction of molten corium with water, creating a steam explosion of unprecedented magnitude. Computer simulations have shown that under the extreme conditions present in the Chernobyl reactor, such an explosion could have generated pressure sufficient to destroy the reactor building and launch debris hundreds of meters into the air. The explosions destroyed the reactor building's roof and walls, exposing the destroyed reactor core to the atmosphere. The graphite moderator, now exposed to air and heated to extreme temperatures, began to burn. This graphite fire would continue for days, acting like a chimney that carried radioactive particles high into the atmosphere where they could be dispersed by wind over vast distances. The graphite fire was particularly dangerous because it created a pathway for radioactive material to reach the upper atmosphere. The burning graphite created a strong updraft that carried radioactive particles to altitudes of several kilometers, where they could be transported by high-altitude winds across national boundaries. This made the Chernobyl accident not just a local disaster, but an international crisis. The immediate aftermath of the explosions was chaotic and confused. The plant's control room was filled with dust and debris, and many of the instruments that would normally provide information about reactor conditions were damaged or destroyed. The operators who survived the initial explosions found themselves in a situation unlike anything they had been trained for. Many of them did not initially understand that the reactor had been completely destroyed and continued to follow procedures designed for less severe accidents. The control room itself was a scene of devastation. The explosions had shattered windows, damaged control panels, and filled the air with radioactive dust. The operators who remained at their posts were exposed to high levels of radiation, but many of them continued to work, trying to understand what had happened and to bring the situation under control. Their dedication and professionalism in the face of mortal danger was remarkable. Plant management and government officials were equally unprepared for the scale of the disaster. Initial reports suggested that the reactor was intact and that the situation was under control. This was partly due to the difficulty of assessing the damage in the immediate aftermath, but also reflected a culture of secrecy and reluctance to report bad news that was endemic in the Soviet system. Viktor Byakhanov, the plant director, was awakened at home and told that there had been an explosion at the plant. When he arrived at the facility, he was briefed by his staff, who initially believed that the reactor vessel was intact and that the explosion had occurred in the steam system. This misunderstanding persisted for several hours and contributed to delays in implementing appropriate emergency measures. The first responders to arrive at the scene were the plant's own fire brigade, led by Lieutenant Leonid Telyatnikov. These brave men had no idea they were walking into a highly radioactive environment that would prove fatal to many of them. They focused on extinguishing fires in the turbine hall and other parts of the plant, not realizing that the graphite fire in the reactor core was the most dangerous and would prove nearly impossible to extinguish with conventional firefighting methods. The plant fire brigade consisted of about 30 men who were trained to deal with conventional industrial fires. They had no special training or equipment for dealing with radioactive fires, and they had no way of measuring the radiation levels they were encountering. They approached the fire as they would any other industrial emergency, not realizing that they were being exposed to lethal levels of radiation. The firefighters worked through the night, many of them receiving lethal doses of radiation in the process. They succeeded in preventing the fire from spreading to the other reactors at the plant, which could have caused an even greater catastrophe. However, the cost was enormous. Of the first responders who worked at the plant in the hours immediately following the explosion, many would die from acute radiation syndrome within weeks or months. Lieutenant Telyatnikov himself received a massive radiation dose but survived, though he suffered from radiation-related health problems for the rest of his life. His leadership and courage during the emergency response were exemplary, and he was later recognized as a hero of the Soviet Union for his actions. Many of his men were not so fortunate, and several died within weeks of the accident. As dawn broke on April 26th, the true scale of the disaster began to become apparent. The destroyed reactor was releasing enormous quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere, creating a plume that would eventually spread across much of Europe. The immediate area around the plant was contaminated with levels of radiation that were lethal within minutes of exposure. Yet incredibly, many plant workers and emergency responders continued to work in these conditions, often without adequate protective equipment or even knowledge of the radiation levels they were facing. The radiation levels around the plant were unprecedented in civilian nuclear accidents. Measurements taken in the hours after the explosion showed radiation levels of thousands of roentgens per hour in some areas, levels that would cause death within minutes of exposure. For comparison, normal background radiation is measured in microroentgens per hour, making the Chernobyl levels millions of times higher than normal. The Soviet government's initial response was characterized by secrecy and denial. Local authorities were not immediately informed of the severity of the situation, and no evacuation orders were issued for the nearby city of Pripyat. Residents went about their normal activities on April 26th, many of them spending time outdoors, enjoying the spring weather, unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. The secrecy surrounding the accident was partly due to the Soviet system's tendency to suppress bad news, but it was also influenced by a genuine lack of understanding about the severity of the situation. The plant management and local officials were receiving conflicting information about the extent of the damage, and it took time for the true scale of the disaster to become clear. It was not until the evening of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, that the evacuation of Pripyat began. Even then, residents were told it was a temporary precaution and were advised to bring only essential items for a few days away from home. Many left their doors unlocked and their belongings behind, expecting to return soon. They would never see their homes again. The delay in evacuation was one of the most tragic aspects of the Chernobyl disaster. During the 36 hours between the explosion and the evacuation, residents of Pripyat were exposed to significant levels of radiation, particularly radioactive iodine, which concentrates in the thyroid gland. Children were especially vulnerable, as their thyroid glands are more active and they consume more milk, which can contain concentrated radioactive iodine. The evacuation of Pripyat was a massive logistical operation involving hundreds of buses and thousands of personnel. In just a few hours, nearly 50,000 people were relocated to temporary housing in other parts of Ukraine. The evacuation was conducted efficiently, but it came too late to prevent significant radiation exposure for many residents, particularly children who are more susceptible to the effects of radioactive iodine. The buses used for the evacuation became contaminated with radioactive material and had to be abandoned in a vehicle graveyard that still exists today. The drivers and other personnel involved in the evacuation were also exposed to radiation, though most received lower doses than the plant workers and emergency responders who worked directly at the accident site. Meanwhile, at the plant itself, efforts to contain the disaster were beginning in earnest. The immediate priority was to extinguish the graphite fire in the reactor core, which was continuing to release radioactive material into the atmosphere. Conventional firefighting methods were ineffective against the intense heat and radiation, so authorities began dropping materials from helicopters in an attempt to smother the fire. A decision to use helicopters to drop materials on the reactor was made by a crisis committee that included senior Soviet officials and nuclear experts. The committee was led by Boris Sherbina, a deputy prime minister who had been sent to Chernobyl to take charge of the emergency response. Sherbina was not a nuclear expert, but he was an experienced crisis manager who understood the need for decisive action. The helicopter operations were extraordinarily dangerous, requiring pilots to fly directly over the destroyed reactor core where radiation levels were lethal. The crews dropped a mixture of sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the reactor in an attempt to absorb neutrons, provide shielding, and smother the fire. These brave pilots, many of whom received significant radiation doses, made hundreds of flights over the reactor in the days following the explosion. The helicopter pilots were military aviators who volunteered for the mission, despite understanding the risks involved. They flew aging Mi-8 helicopters that were not designed for precision dropping operations, making their task even more difficult. The pilots had to fly low and slow over the reactor to accurately drop their loads, maximizing their exposure to radiation. The helicopter drops initially seemed to make the situation worse, as the added material may have insulated the burning graphite and caused temperatures to rise even higher. However, the operations continued for several days, with crews dropping approximately 5,000 tons of material onto the reactor. Eventually, the graphite fire began to subside, though whether this was due to the helicopter drops or simply because the graphite had burned itself out remains a matter of debate. The materials dropped on the reactor included sand to smother the fire, clay to seal cracks and prevent the escape of radioactive gases, lead to provide radiation shielding, and boron to absorb neutrons and prevent any possibility of renewed nuclear reactions. The choice of materials was based on the best available scientific advice, but the effectiveness of the drops was difficult to assess due to the extreme conditions at the reactor site. As the immediate crisis at the reactor began to stabilize, attention turned to the longer-term challenges of containment and cleanup. The destroyed reactor core contained enormous quantities of radioactive material, including highly dangerous isotopes like cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239. This material needed to be contained to prevent further environmental contamination and to allow cleanup work to proceed. The radioactive inventory of the Chernobyl reactor at the time of the accident was enormous. The reactor contained about 190 tons of uranium fuel, along with fission products that had accumulated during 3 years of operation. The explosion and fire released an estimated 3 to 4% of this radioactive material into the environment, but this small percentage still represented an enormous quantity of contamination. The solution was to construct a massive concrete and steel structure over the destroyed reactor, which became known as the sarcophagus. This was an unprecedented engineering challenge, requiring workers to operate in extremely high radiation fields while constructing a building over a destroyed nuclear reactor. The work was carried out by thousands of Soviet military personnel, plant workers, and volunteers who became known as liquidators. The design of the sarcophagus was developed quickly under extreme pressure. Engineers had to create a structure that would contain radioactive material while being built in a highly contaminated environment. The design called for a steel framework covered with concrete panels, with the entire structure supported by the remaining walls of the reactor building. The liquidators came from all over the Soviet Union, representing a cross-section of Soviet society. They included military personnel, nuclear engineers, construction workers, miners, and ordinary citizens who volunteered for what they knew was dangerous work. Many were motivated by patriotism and a sense of duty, while others were simply following orders. The total number of liquidators who worked at Chernobyl is estimated to be between 600,000 and 800,000 people. The liquidators were organized into military-style units with strict discipline and clear chains of command. They worked in shifts, with exposure limits that were supposed to prevent anyone from receiving more than a certain dose of radiation. However, these limits were often exceeded, and many liquidators received doses that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. The work of the liquidators was incredibly dangerous and difficult. Radiation levels in many areas around the plant were so high that workers could only spend a few minutes at a time in the most contaminated zones. They worked in shifts, with some tasks requiring workers to run in, perform a specific action, and run out as quickly as possible to minimize radiation exposure. Despite these precautions, many liquidators received significant radiation doses that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. The most dangerous work was performed by specialists known as biorobots, human workers who performed tasks that were too dangerous or complex for mechanical robots. These workers wore lead aprons and other protective equipment, but they were still exposed to extremely high levels of radiation. They worked in teams, with each worker spending only a few minutes in the most contaminated areas before being replaced by another team member. One of the most dangerous tasks faced by the liquidators was clearing radioactive debris from the roof of a reactor building. This debris, which included pieces of the reactor core itself, was so radioactive that it would have quickly killed anyone who remained near it for more than a few minutes. Initially, authorities attempted to use remote-controlled robots to clear the debris, but the intense radiation destroyed the electronic systems of even specially hardened military robots. The robots used at Chernobyl included both Soviet-built machines and Western robots that were donated for the cleanup effort. The most famous was a German robot called Joker, which was designed for bomb disposal work. However, even these sophisticated machines failed when exposed to the extreme radiation levels on the reactor roof, with their electronic circuits being destroyed by the intense radiation field. With robots proving ineffective, a task fell to human workers who became known as biorobots. These brave men, wearing lead aprons and other protective gear, would run onto the roof, shovel radioactive debris into the destroyed reactor core, and run back to safety, all in the space of 90 seconds or less. Each worker could only make 1 or 2 trips before reaching their maximum allowable radiation dose. Hundreds of men participated in this operation, which was essential for the construction of the sarcophagus. The biorobots were carefully selected for their physical fitness and mental toughness. They underwent special training to prepare them for the extreme conditions they would face, including practice runs on mock-ups of the reactor roof. Each worker was equipped with a dosimeter to measure radiation exposure, and they were strictly limited in the time they could spend in the contaminated areas. The construction of the sarcophagus itself was a remarkable feat of engineering under extreme conditions. The structure needed to be built quickly to contain the radioactive material, But it also had to be constructed largely by remote methods due to the high radiation levels. The final structure was a massive concrete and steel shell that enclosed the destroyed reactor building, though it was always intended as a temporary solution. The sarcophagus construction required innovative engineering solutions to deal with the extreme conditions. Much of the work had to be done remotely, using cranes and other equipment operated from safe distances. The workers who did have to enter contaminated areas were strictly limited in their exposure time, and the construction schedule was designed to minimize the total radiation dose to the workforce. While the sarcophagus was being constructed, other liquidators were working to decontaminate the surrounding area. This involved removing topsoil, washing down buildings, and disposing of contaminated materials. Entire forests were cut down and buried because the trees had absorbed radioactive material. The cleanup operation was massive in scope, covering hundreds of square kilometers around the plant. The decontamination work was painstaking and dangerous. Workers used high-pressure hoses to wash radioactive particles off buildings and roads, but this often just moved the contamination from one place to another. Topsoil was scraped up and buried in special disposal sites, and contaminated vegetation was cut down and disposed of as radioactive waste. The forest cleanup was particularly challenging because trees had absorbed radioactive material through their roots and leaves. The contaminated trees had to be cut down, processed, and buried in special disposal sites. This work created enormous quantities of radioactive waste that had to be managed and stored safely. The human cost of the Chernobyl disaster extends far beyond the immediate casualties. While the official Soviet death toll was initially reported as just 31 people, this figure included only those who died immediately from the explosion or acute radiation syndrome in the first few months. The true long-term health impact is much more difficult to assess and remains a subject of scientific debate. The 31 official deaths included plant workers who died in the explosion, firefighters and other emergency responders who died from acute radiation syndrome, and a few others who died from various causes in the immediate aftermath of the accident. However, this number did not include deaths that occurred later from radiation-related illnesses, nor did it account for the increased cancer rates in the affected population. Acute radiation syndrome affected several hundred people who were exposed to very high levels of radiation in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. This condition, caused by damage to the body's blood-forming organs and digestive system, was often fatal despite the best medical treatment available. The most severely affected victims were plant workers and emergency responders who were present during or immediately after the explosion. The symptoms of acute radiation syndrome develop in stages, beginning with nausea, vomiting, and fatigue within hours of exposure. This is followed by a latent period where victims may feel better, but then more severe symptoms develop, including bleeding, infection, and organ failure. The severity of the syndrome depends on the radiation dose received, with doses above 400 rem usually being fatal without medical treatment. The treatment of acute radiation syndrome victims became a major medical challenge. Many were flown to specialized hospitals in Moscow where Soviet doctors, working with international experts, attempted treatments that were largely experimental at the time. Some patients received bone marrow transplants in an attempt to restore their blood-forming capacity. Though these procedures had limited success, given the severity of the radiation exposure. The medical response to Chernobyl involved doctors and medical facilities from across the Soviet Union and beyond. The most severely injured victims were treated at Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, which specialized in radiation medicine. International medical experts, including doctors from the United States and Western Europe, provided advice and assistance in treating the victims. Beyond acute radiation syndrome, the long-term health effects of Chernobyl exposure include increased rates of thyroid cancer, particularly among children who were exposed to radioactive iodine in the days following the explosion. Radioactive iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland And children are particularly susceptible because their thyroids are still developing and they consume more milk, which can contain concentrated radioactive iodine from contaminated pastures. The thyroid cancer epidemic that followed Chernobyl was one of the most clearly documented health effects of the disaster. Beginning about 4 years after the accident, rates of thyroid cancer in children began to increase dramatically in the affected areas. By the late 1990s, thousands of cases had been diagnosed, with the highest rates occurring in areas that received the heaviest contamination with radioactive iodine. Studies conducted in the years following Chernobyl have documented significant increases in thyroid cancer rates in the affected regions, particularly in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. Thousands of cases have been attributed to Chernobyl exposure, though the exact number remains disputed. Most of these cancers are treatable if detected early, but they represent a significant health burden for the affected populations. The screening programs established after Chernobyl to detect thyroid cancer have been remarkably successful in identifying cases early when they are most treatable. However, the psychological impact of living with the knowledge that one has been exposed to radiation and is at increased risk of cancer has been significant for many people in the affected areas. The psychological and social impacts of Chernobyl have been equally significant. Hundreds of thousands of people were relocated from contaminated areas, losing their homes, communities, and ways of life. Many evacuees struggled with depression, anxiety, and a sense of displacement that persisted for years or even decades after the disaster. The stigma associated with being a Chernobyl victim also affected many people's ability to find employment or form relationships. The psychological effects of the Chernobyl disaster have been studied extensively by researchers from many countries. The stress of evacuation, the fear of radiation exposure, and the disruption of social networks all contributed to increased rates of mental health problems in the affected population. Many people developed what researchers called radiophobia, an excessive fear of radiation that could be debilitating. The social disruption caused by Chernobyl was enormous. Entire communities were broken up as people were relocated to different areas. Traditional ways of life, particularly in rural areas where people had lived off the land for generations, were destroyed. Many people never fully recovered from the loss of their homes and communities. The economic impact of Chernobyl was enormous, both for the Soviet Union and for the affected regions. The immediate costs of the emergency response, evacuation, and initial cleanup were estimated in the billions of rubles. The long-term costs, including ongoing medical care, environmental monitoring, and economic support for affected populations, have continued to mount for decades. The economic costs of Chernobyl have been estimated by various organizations, with figures ranging from tens of billions to hundreds of billions of dollars. The costs include not only the direct expenses of cleanup and medical care, but also the economic losses from abandoned agricultural land, reduced tourism, and the stigma associated with products from the affected areas. The disaster also had profound political implications. For the Soviet Union, the initial secrecy and mishandling of the crisis damaged the credibility of the Soviet government and contributed to growing public skepticism about official pronouncements. The policy of glasnost, or openness, that was being promoted by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was put to a severe test by Chernobyl, and many observers believe that the government's handling of the disaster accelerated the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev himself later acknowledged that Chernobyl was a major factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The disaster exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system, including its tendency toward secrecy, its resistance to admitting mistakes, and its inability to respond effectively to unexpected crises. The international attention focused on Chernobyl also made it difficult for the Soviet government to maintain its claims of technological superiority. Internationally, Chernobyl had immediate and lasting effects on the nuclear power industry. The disaster demonstrated that nuclear accidents could have consequences that crossed national borders, as radioactive contamination from Chernobyl was detected across Europe and even in North America. This led to increased international cooperation on nuclear safety and the development of new safety standards and protocols. The international response to Chernobyl included both immediate assistance and long-term cooperation on nuclear safety. Western countries provided medical supplies, equipment, and expertise to help deal with the emergency. International organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency played important roles in coordinating the response and developing new safety standards. The environmental impact of Chernobyl created what is now known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a roughly 30-kilometer radius around the plant where human habitation is still restricted. This area, covering about 2,600 square kilometers, has become an unintended nature preserve where wildlife populations have recovered dramatically in the absence of human activity, despite ongoing radioactive contamination. The exclusion zone is a unique environment where the effects of radiation can be studied in isolation from other human impacts. The area includes abandoned cities and villages, contaminated forests, and areas where radiation levels remain dangerously high. Despite the contamination, many species of wildlife have thrived in the absence of human activity. The exclusion zone presents a complex ecological picture. While radiation levels remain elevated in many areas, and some species show genetic effects from radiation exposure, the overall biodiversity has increased significantly since the evacuation of humans. Populations of wolves, bears, lynx, and other large mammals have recovered to levels not seen in the region for decades. This has led to important scientific insights about the relative impacts of human activity versus radiation on wildlife populations. The wildlife recovery in the exclusion zone has been remarkable. Species that had been rare or absent from the region have returned in large numbers. The absence of hunting, farming, and other human activities has allowed ecosystems to recover in ways that would not have been possible if the area had remained inhabited. Scientific research in the Chernobyl area continues to this day, providing valuable data on the long-term effects of radiation exposure on both human and animal populations. The site has become a unique natural laboratory for studying radiation effects, ecosystem recovery, and the interaction between human activity and environmental contamination. The research conducted in the Chernobyl area has contributed to our understanding of radiation biology, ecology, and environmental science. Studies of plants and animals in the exclusion zone have provided insights into how organisms adapt to chronic radiation exposure and how ecosystems respond to major disturbances. The technical investigation into the causes of the Chernobyl disaster revealed fundamental flaws in both the RBMK reactor design and the safety culture of the Soviet nuclear program. The positive void coefficient that made the reactor unstable at low power levels was a known issue, but one that had not been adequately addressed in the design or operating procedures. The control rod design flaw that caused the initial power spike during the scram was also known to some engineers, but had not been widely communicated or corrected. The investigation into the causes of Chernobyl was conducted by both Soviet and international experts. The findings revealed a complex interaction of design flaws, procedural violations, and human errors that combined to create the conditions for disaster. The investigation led to significant changes in reactor design and operating procedures. The investigation also revealed serious deficiencies in operator training and safety procedures. The operators conducting the test were not fully aware of the reactor's behavior under the conditions they created, and they violated several safety procedures in their attempt to complete the test. The culture of secrecy and hierarchy in the Soviet nuclear program discouraged operators from questioning procedures or reporting safety concerns, contributing to the conditions that made the disaster possible. The safety culture problems identified at Chernobyl were not unique to the Soviet nuclear program, but were found to exist in varying degrees in nuclear programs around the world. The accident led to increased emphasis on safety culture and the importance of creating environments where workers feel free to raise safety concerns without fear of retribution. In response to these findings, significant changes were made to RBMK reactors throughout the Soviet Union and later Russia. The control rod design was modified to eliminate the positive reactivity insertion during scram. Additional safety systems were installed, and operating procedures were revised to prevent the conditions that led to the Chernobyl accident. These modifications have made the remaining RBMK reactors much safer, though they still lack the containment structures common in Western reactor designs. The modifications to RBMK reactors included changes to the control rod design, installation of additional safety systems, and improvements to operator training and procedures. These changes were implemented at all operating RBMK reactors and significantly improved their safety characteristics. The international nuclear community also learned important lessons from Chernobyl. The accident highlighted the importance of safety culture in nuclear operations and led to increased emphasis on training, procedures, and the reporting of safety concerns. International organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency strengthened their safety standards and inspection programs, and new mechanisms for international cooperation in nuclear emergencies were established. The lessons learned from Chernobyl have been incorporated into nuclear safety practices around the world. The accident demonstrated the importance of defense in depth, the need for robust containment systems, and the critical role of safety culture in preventing accidents. The design of new nuclear reactors has been heavily influenced by the lessons of Chernobyl. Modern reactor designs incorporate passive safety systems that do not rely on human intervention or external power to function safely. These systems are designed to shut down the reactor and provide cooling automatically in the event of an accident, reducing the risk of operator error or equipment failure leading to a serious accident. The new generation of nuclear reactors includes advanced safety features that were developed in response to lessons learned from Chernobyl and other nuclear accidents. These reactors are designed to be inherently safe, with physics-based safety systems that function without human intervention or external power. The Chernobyl disaster also accelerated research into severe accident management and the development of procedures for dealing with beyond design basis accidents. Nuclear plants around the world now have detailed procedures for managing severe accidents, including core damage scenarios that were not adequately considered before Chernobyl. Severe accident management has become a major focus of nuclear safety research and regulation. Plants now have procedures and equipment specifically designed to deal with accidents that exceed the original design basis, including scenarios similar to what occurred at Chernobyl. The construction of the original sarcophagus was always intended as a temporary measure, and by the 1990s, it was clear that a more permanent solution was needed. The structure was deteriorating due to the harsh conditions and the speed with which it had been constructed, raising concerns about the potential collapse of portions of the structure and the release of additional radioactive material. The sarcophagus served its purpose of containing radioactive material for several decades, but it was not designed to last indefinitely. By the 1990s, cracks were appearing in the structure, and there were concerns about its long-term stability. The harsh conditions inside the sarcophagus, including high radiation levels and temperature fluctuations, were causing the structure to deteriorate. The solution was the construction of a new safe confinement, a massive arch-shaped structure that would be built adjacent to the sarcophagus and then slid into place over the entire reactor building. This project, funded by international donors and managed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, represented one of the largest engineering projects in the world. The new safe confinement project was an international effort involving dozens of countries and organizations. The project was funded through the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, which raised over $2 billion from international donors. The design and construction involved companies and experts from around the world. The new safe confinement is an enormous structure, standing 108 meters high and spanning 257 meters, making it one of the largest movable structures ever built. The arch was constructed using advanced engineering techniques and materials designed to last for 100 years. It includes sophisticated ventilation and monitoring systems, as well as remote-controlled equipment for the eventual dismantling of the sarcophagus and removal of radioactive material. The engineering challenges involved in building the new safe confinement were enormous. The structure had to be built in a highly contaminated environment, moved into position over the existing sarcophagus, and designed to contain radioactive material for a century. The project required innovations in construction techniques, materials science, and remote handling technology. The installation of the new safe confinement was completed in 2016, marking a major milestone in the long-term management of the Chernobyl site. The structure not only provides improved containment of radioactive material, but also creates a controlled environment for the eventual cleanup and dismantling of the sarcophagus and removal of radioactive material. The completion of the new safe confinement was celebrated as a major achievement in international cooperation and engineering. The structure provides a safe environment for workers to begin the long process of dismantling the original sarcophagus and removing the radioactive materials inside. This work is expected to take decades and will require the development of new technologies for handling highly radioactive materials. The project represents one of the most challenging engineering and environmental remediation efforts ever undertaken. The dismantling work will involve the use of advanced robotics and remote handling systems to safely remove radioactive materials from inside the sarcophagus. The work must be done carefully to avoid disturbing the fuel-containing materials and creating additional contamination. The legacy of Chernobyl extends far beyond the technical and environmental aspects of the disaster. The event has become a powerful symbol in discussions about nuclear energy, technological risk, and the relationship between government and society. For supporters of nuclear energy, Chernobyl represents the consequences of poor design and inadequate safety culture, problems that have been addressed in modern reactor designs. For critics, it demonstrates the inherent risks of nuclear technology and the potential for catastrophic consequences when things go wrong. The symbolic power of Chernobyl has influenced public opinion about nuclear energy for decades. The disaster has become shorthand for the potential dangers of nuclear technology, and the name Chernobyl is often invoked in debates about nuclear energy policy. The cultural impact of Chernobyl has been enormous, inspiring countless books, films, documentaries, and other works of art. The disaster has become a touchstone for discussions about technological hubris, environmental destruction, and the human cost of industrial accidents. The abandoned city of Pripyat, with its empty buildings and overgrown streets, has become an iconic image of technological failure and environmental catastrophe. The artistic and cultural responses to Chernobyl have helped to humanize the disaster and convey its emotional impact. Works of literature, film, and visual art have explored themes of loss, sacrifice, and resilience in the face of technological disaster. Tourism to the Chernobyl exclusion zone has grown significantly in recent years, with thousands of visitors taking guided tours to see the abandoned city of Pripyat and learn about the disaster. This dark tourism raises complex questions about the appropriate way to remember and learn from tragic events, but it also provides an important source of funding for ongoing monitoring and maintenance of the site. The growth of tourism to Chernobyl has been controversial, with some arguing that it trivializes the suffering of those affected by the disaster. However, others see it as an important way to educate people about the risks of nuclear technology and the importance of safety. The scientific legacy of Chernobyl continues to evolve as researchers gain new insights into the long-term effects of radiation exposure and environmental contamination. Studies of the affected populations have provided valuable data on radiation health effects, while research in the exclusion zone has advanced our understanding of ecosystem, recovery, and the effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure on wildlife. The ongoing research at Chernobyl has contributed to many fields of science, from radiation biology to ecology to psychology. The site continues to provide unique opportunities for research that would not be possible elsewhere. Recent research has challenged some earlier assumptions about the health effects of Chernobyl exposure. While the increase in thyroid cancer is well documented, studies have found less evidence for increases in other types of cancer than some early predictions suggested. This has led to ongoing debates about radiation risk models and the appropriate response to low-level radiation exposure. The evolving understanding of Chernobyl's health effects has important implications for radiation protection standards and emergency response planning. As more data becomes available, scientists are refining their understanding of radiation risks and the most effective ways to protect public health. The Chernobyl disaster also highlighted the importance of emergency, preparedness, and response planning for nuclear accidents. The delayed evacuation of Pripyat and the initial confusion about the severity of the accident demonstrated the need for clear emergency procedures and effective communication systems. Modern nuclear emergency planning incorporates lessons learned from Chernobyl, including the importance of rapid decision-making, clear communication with the public, and coordination between different levels of government. Emergency planning for nuclear accidents has been revolutionized since Chernobyl. Modern emergency plans include detailed procedures for rapid assessment of accident severity, prompt protective actions for the public, and effective communication strategies to maintain public trust and cooperation. The international response to Chernobyl also established important precedents for cooperation in nuclear emergencies. The Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Assistance in the Case of a Nuclear Accident or Radiological Emergency were both developed in response to Chernobyl and provide frameworks for international cooperation in future nuclear emergencies. These international agreements have created mechanisms for rapid sharing of information about nuclear accidents and for providing assistance to affected countries. The agreements have been tested in subsequent nuclear emergencies and have proven valuable for coordinating international responses. The economic development of the affected regions has been significantly impacted by the disaster, with some areas still struggling with the economic consequences decades later. Agricultural restrictions, population displacement, and the stigma associated with Chernobyl contamination have all contributed to ongoing economic challenges. However, some regions have also benefited from international aid and investment in cleanup and monitoring activities. The long-term economic impacts of Chernobyl have been complex and varied. While some areas have suffered from ongoing restrictions and stigma, others have benefited from international investment in research, monitoring, and cleanup activities. The management of the Chernobyl site itself has evolved significantly since the disaster. What began as an emergency response has developed into a long-term program of monitoring, maintenance, and gradual cleanup. The site now employs thousands of people in various capacities, from radiation monitoring to tourism services, creating a unique economy built around managing the consequences of the disaster. The Chernobyl site has become a major employer in the region, with thousands of people working on various aspects of site management, research, and tourism. This has created economic opportunities in an area that was devastated by the disaster. The technical challenges of managing the Chernobyl site continue to evolve as conditions change and new technologies become available. The fuel-containing materials inside the sarcophagus remain highly radioactive and present ongoing challenges for monitoring and eventual removal. Research into the behavior of these materials under the conditions inside the sarcophagus has revealed complex chemical and physical processes that were not well understood at the time of the accident. The fuel-containing materials inside the sarcophagus have undergone complex chemical and physical changes over the decades since the accident. Understanding these changes is crucial for planning the eventual removal and disposal of these materials. One of the most intriguing discoveries at Chernobyl has been the identification of radiotrophic fungi that appear to use radiation as an energy source, similar to how plants use sunlight for photosynthesis. These organisms, found growing on the walls of the destroyed reactor, represent a fascinating example of life adapting to extreme conditions and have potential applications in biotechnology and space exploration. The discovery of radiotrophic fungi at Chernobyl has opened up new areas of research in biology and biotechnology. These organisms may have applications in bioremediation, space exploration, and other fields where organisms must survive in extreme radiation environments. The social and political legacy of Chernobyl continues to influence discussions about nuclear energy policy around the world. The disaster contributed to the decline of nuclear power construction in many countries and influenced public opinion about nuclear energy for decades. However, concerns about climate change and the need for low-carbon energy sources have led to renewed interest in nuclear power in some countries, with proponents arguing that modern reactor designs are much safer than the RBMK, reactors involved in the Chernobyl accident. The debate over nuclear energy in the post-Chernobyl era has been shaped by competing concerns about safety and climate change. While some countries have moved away from nuclear power, others have embraced it as a low-carbon alternative to fossil fuels. The role of human factors in the Chernobyl disaster has been extensively studied and has influenced safety practices across many industries, not just nuclear power. The accident demonstrated how a combination of design flaws, procedural violations, and poor communication can lead to catastrophic consequences. This has led to increased emphasis on safety culture, human factors engineering, and the importance of creating systems that are resilient to human error. The study of human factors in the Chernobyl accident has contributed to improvements in safety practices across many industries. The lessons learned about the importance of safety culture, communication, and system design have been applied in aviation, chemical processing, and other high-risk industries. The environmental monitoring program established after Chernobyl has provided unprecedented data on the long-term behavior of radioactive contamination in the environment. This research has advanced our understanding of how radioactive materials move through ecosystems, how they are taken up by plants and animals, and how contamination levels change over time. This knowledge has been valuable not only for managing the Chernobyl site, but also for understanding the environmental impacts of nuclear weapons testing and other sources of radioactive contamination. The environmental monitoring program at Chernobyl has created one of the most comprehensive databases of environmental radioactivity in the world. This data has been invaluable for understanding the long-term behavior of radioactive contamination and for developing models to predict the environmental impacts of future nuclear accidents. The medical response to Chernobyl also advanced the field of radiation medicine and emergency medical preparedness. The treatment of acute radiation syndrome victims provided valuable clinical experience that has informed treatment protocols for radiation emergencies. The long-term health monitoring of exposed populations has also contributed to our understanding of radiation health effects and has influenced radiation protection standards worldwide. The medical lessons learned from Chernobyl have improved the ability of medical professionals to respond to radiation emergencies. Treatment protocols developed for Chernobyl victims have been refined and are now used in medical centers around the world. The psychological and social support systems developed for Chernobyl victims have provided models for responding to other technological disasters and mass casualty events. The recognition that technological disasters can have profound psychological and social impacts beyond their immediate physical effects has influenced emergency response planning and victim support programs for a wide range of disasters. The psychological support programs developed for Chernobyl victims have been adapted for use in other disasters and emergencies. The recognition of the importance of mental health support in disaster response has become a standard part of emergency planning. The Chernobyl disaster also highlighted the importance of public communication during emergencies. The initial secrecy and misinformation surrounding the accident contributed to public distrust and may have increased health impacts by delaying protective actions. This has led to increased emphasis on transparent, timely, and accurate public communication during emergencies, with recognition that maintaining public trust is essential for effective emergency response. The communication failures during the Chernobyl emergency have become a case study in crisis communication. The lessons learned have influenced the development of communication strategies for nuclear and other technological emergencies. The international scientific collaboration that emerged in response to Chernobyl has continued to this day and has served as a model for international cooperation on other global challenges. The sharing of data, expertise, and resources among scientists from different countries has advanced our understanding of the disaster's impacts and has contributed to improved safety practices worldwide. The international scientific cooperation that began with Chernobyl has created lasting partnerships and institutions that continue to address global challenges. This model of cooperation has been applied to other issues such as climate change and pandemic response. The legal and regulatory changes that followed Chernobyl have had lasting impacts on nuclear safety regulation around the world. Many countries strengthened their nuclear regulatory agencies, improved safety standards, and enhanced inspection and enforcement programs. The accident also led to increased international cooperation on nuclear safety, with organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency playing a larger role in promoting safety, standards, and best practices. The regulatory changes implemented after Chernobyl have significantly improved nuclear safety oversight around the world. Regulatory agencies have been strengthened, safety standards have been enhanced, and international cooperation has been increased. The Chernobyl disaster has also influenced the development of international law regarding transboundary environmental damage. The fact that radioactive contamination from the accident affected many countries that had no involvement in the operation of the plant raised important questions about liability and compensation for transboundary environmental damage. These issues continue to be relevant as the world grapples with other global environmental challenges. The legal precedents established by Chernobyl have influenced the development of international environmental law. The principles of state responsibility for transboundary environmental damage have been refined and applied to other global environmental issues. The educational impact of Chernobyl has been significant, with the disaster becoming a case study in engineering schools, business schools, and public policy programs around the world. The accident provides valuable lessons about risk management, crisis communication, organizational culture, and the importance of safety in complex technological systems. These lessons have applications far beyond the nuclear industry. Chernobyl has become one of the most studied disasters in history, providing lessons that are taught in universities and professional training programs around the world. The case study has applications in many fields, from engineering to management to public policy. The commemoration and memorialization of Chernobyl has evolved over the decades since the disaster. Initially, the Soviet government was reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of the accident. But as more information became available and political conditions changed, there has been increased recognition of the victims and heroes of Chernobyl. Memorials have been erected to honor the liquidators and other victims, and April 26th is now observed as a day of remembrance in several countries. The memorialization of Chernobyl has helped to ensure that the lessons of the disaster are not forgotten. Memorials and museums have been established to honor the victims and to educate future generations about the importance of nuclear safety. The role of the media in covering Chernobyl has also been significant and has influenced how subsequent disasters are reported. The initial secrecy surrounding the accident meant that much. Early reporting was based on incomplete or inaccurate information. But as more details became available, journalists played an important role in informing the public about the disaster's impacts. The coverage of Chernobyl also highlighted the challenges of reporting on complex technical subjects and the importance of scientific literacy in journalism. The media coverage of Chernobyl has become a case study in science journalism and crisis communication. The challenges of reporting on complex technical subjects under conditions of uncertainty have influenced journalism, education, and practice. The artistic and cultural responses to Chernobyl have been diverse and powerful, ranging from documentary photography and literature to music and visual art. These works have helped to humanize the disaster and to convey its emotional and psychological impacts in ways that technical reports cannot. They have also played an important role in keeping the memory of Chernobyl alive and ensuring that its lessons are not forgotten. The cultural legacy of Chernobyl includes works of art, literature, film, and music that have helped to process the meaning and significance of the disaster. These cultural works have contributed to public understanding of the disaster and its impacts. The technological innovations that have emerged from Chernobyl research have had applications beyond nuclear safety. The development of remote-controlled equipment for working in high-radiation environments has contributed to advances in robotics and automation. Research on radiation-resistant materials and electronics has had applications in space exploration and other extreme environments. The monitoring and measurement technologies developed for Chernobyl have been used in other environmental monitoring applications. The technological innovations developed for Chernobyl have found applications in many other fields. Advances in robotics, materials science, and monitoring technology have benefited industries ranging from space exploration to environmental monitoring. The Chernobyl disaster has also influenced the development of risk assessment and risk management methodologies. The accident demonstrated the importance of considering low probability, high consequence events in risk analysis, and highlighted the limitations of traditional risk assessment approaches. This has led to the development of more sophisticated risk assessment methods that better account for uncertainty and the potential for cascading failures.
The risk assessment methodologies developed in response to Chernobyl have improved the ability to assess and manage risks in complex technological systems. These methods have been applied in many industries and have contributed to improved safety practices. The insurance and financial implications of Chernobyl have been significant and have influenced how the nuclear industry manages financial risk. The enormous costs associated with the accident, including cleanup, compensation, and lost economic activity, have led to the development of international insurance pools and compensation mechanisms for nuclear accidents. These financial arrangements are designed to ensure that funds are available to respond to future nuclear accidents and to compensate victims. The financial mechanisms developed in response to Chernobyl have created systems for managing the economic risks associated with nuclear accidents. These systems provide compensation for victims and funding for cleanup activities. The Chernobyl disaster has also influenced urban planning and land use policies in areas affected by the accident. The creation of the exclusion zone and the restrictions on agricultural activities in contaminated areas have required new approaches to land management and regional development. Some areas have been successfully rehabilitated and returned to productive use, while others remain restricted decades after the accident. The land use planning challenges created by Chernobyl have required innovative approaches to managing contaminated areas. Some areas have been successfully rehabilitated, while others remain restricted for safety reasons. The role of international organizations in responding to Chernobyl has evolved over time and has influenced how the international community responds to other global challenges. The United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, and other international bodies have all played important roles in coordinating the response to Chernobyl and in supporting affected countries. This experience has informed the development of international mechanisms for responding to other types of disasters and global challenges. The international response to Chernobyl has created models for international cooperation in responding to global challenges. The mechanisms developed for Chernobyl have been adapted for use in other disasters and emergencies. The Chernobyl disaster has also had implications for energy policy and the development of alternative energy sources. The accident contributed to increased interest in renewable energy sources and energy efficiency as alternatives to nuclear power. However, the growing concern about climate change has led some to reconsider the role of nuclear energy as a low-carbon alternative to fossil fuels, leading to ongoing debates about the appropriate role of nuclear power in addressing climate change. The energy policy implications of Chernobyl continue to influence debates about the role of nuclear power in addressing climate change. While some see nuclear power as essential for reducing carbon emissions, others argue that the risks demonstrated by Chernobyl make nuclear power unacceptable. The scientific research conducted in the Chernobyl area has contributed to advances in many fields beyond radiation biology and nuclear safety. Studies of ecosystem recovery in the exclusion zone have provided insights into conservation biology and ecosystem management. Research on the social and psychological impacts of the disaster has advanced our understanding of disaster psychology and community resilience. The interdisciplinary nature of Chernobyl research has fostered collaboration between scientists from different fields and has contributed to the development of new research methodologies. The interdisciplinary research conducted at Chernobyl has advanced knowledge and has created new models for collaborative research. The site continues to provide unique opportunities for scientific investigation. The Chernobyl disaster has also influenced the development of emergency response capabilities and disaster preparedness planning. The challenges encountered in responding to the accident have informed the development of emergency response procedures for nuclear and other technological disasters. The importance of having trained personnel, appropriate equipment, and clear procedures has been demonstrated repeatedly in the Chernobyl experience. The emergency response lessons learned from Chernobyl have improved disaster preparedness planning around the world. The importance of training, equipment, and procedures has been emphasized in emergency planning for many types of disasters. The long-term monitoring and surveillance programs established after Chernobyl have provided valuable data on the persistence and behavior of radioactive contamination in the environment. This information has been essential for making decisions about land use, food safety, and public health protection. The monitoring programs have also served as models for environmental surveillance in other contaminated areas around the world. The monitoring programs established after Chernobyl have created comprehensive databases of environmental contamination that continue to provide valuable information for decision-making. These programs have served as models for environmental monitoring in other contaminated areas. The Chernobyl disaster has had profound implications for the nuclear industry's approach to safety and risk management. The accident demonstrated that even very low probability events can have catastrophic consequences, and that safety systems must be designed to handle beyond design basis accidents. This has led to the development of new safety concepts, such as defense in depth, which involves multiple independent layers of safety systems to prevent and mitigate accidents. The safety concepts developed in response to Chernobyl have fundamentally changed how the nuclear industry approaches safety. The emphasis on defense in depth and beyond design basis accidents has led to significant improvements in nuclear safety. The human stories of Chernobyl continue to be told and retold, ensuring that the personal experiences of those affected by the disaster are not forgotten. The accounts of plant operators, emergency responders, evacuees, and liquidators provide powerful testimony to both human courage and human suffering. These stories serve as important reminders of the human cost of technological disasters and the importance of putting safety first in the design and operation of complex systems. The personal stories of Chernobyl victims and heroes provide powerful testimony to the human impact of the disaster. These stories serve as important reminders of the need to prioritize safety in technological systems. The Chernobyl disaster ultimately represents both a tragedy and a testament to human resilience. The immediate consequences were devastating, and the long-term impacts continue to affect thousands of people. However, the response to the disaster also demonstrated remarkable human courage, ingenuity, and cooperation. The lessons learned from Chernobyl have made nuclear facilities around the world safer and have improved our ability to respond to technological disasters. The legacy of Chernobyl encompasses both the tragedy of the disaster and the remarkable human response to it. The lessons learned have contributed to improved safety practices and emergency response capabilities around the world. As we look to the future, the legacy of Chernobyl will continue to influence how we approach complex technological systems and manage the risks they entail. The disaster serves as a permanent reminder that even very low probability events can have catastrophic consequences, and that safety must always be the highest priority in the design and operation of potentially dangerous technologies. The ongoing work at the Chernobyl site will continue for decades to come, requiring sustained commitment and international cooperation. The future management of the Chernobyl site will require continued international cooperation and technological innovation. The lessons learned from the disaster will continue to influence safety, practices, and emergency preparedness for generations to come. The story of Chernobyl is ultimately a human story, one that encompasses both the worst and best aspects of human nature. It is a story of technological hubris and institutional failure, but also of individual heroism and collective determination. It is a story of environmental destruction and human suffering, but also of scientific discovery and international cooperation. Most importantly, it is a story that continues to unfold, with lessons that remain relevant for addressing the technological and environmental challenges of the 21st century. The Chernobyl disaster changed the world in ways that are still being understood and felt today. It demonstrated the global nature of technological risks and the need for international cooperation in managing them. It showed the importance of transparency, accountability, and public participation in decisions about technological risks. It highlighted the resilience of natural systems and the long-term consequences of environmental contamination, and it provided a powerful reminder of both human fallibility and human courage in the face of unprecedented challenges. The legacy of Chernobyl will endure for generations to come, serving as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us of the potential consequences of technological failure and institutional complacency, but it also inspires us with examples of human courage, scientific dedication, and international cooperation in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. As we continue to grapple with complex technological and environmental challenges, the lessons of Chernobyl remain as relevant today as they were on that fateful morning of April 26, 1986, when the world changed forever.